Susan Wright claimed her husband had abused her and attacked first.
He would grab the back of my head and bash it against the dashboard.
But prosecutors said she wanted $200,000 from a life insurance policy. The former stripper also applied for money from a victim's compensation fund 2 days after the killing.
Welcome back to the channel, and thanks for being here. Now, when you first fall in love with someone, everything always seems perfect. But then, what if, maybe months or even years down the road, you find out that that person is not who you thought they were? In some situations like today's case, the person can even get abusive and scary, and getting out seems impossible. But what this woman did to get out of her toxic relationship was beyond anything most would ever contemplate. In 1997, 29-year-old Jeffrey Wright, who was a successful carpet salesman, walked into a restaurant in Galveston, Texas. Here, he would meet a beautiful waitress named Susan, who was 8 years younger than he. Susan, who was 21 years old, was born in Texas, and while she was now working as a waitress, she had previously worked as a topless dancer. After meeting, Susan and Jeffrey had hit it off fast, and they soon began dating. Jeffrey smothered his new girlfriend Susan with kindness, and he would call her 2 to 3 times a day. He would even show up at her work sometimes with flowers or little gifts for her. She thought he was the perfect guy, and Susan and Jeffrey would get married in 1998 when she was 8.5 months pregnant with the couple's son, Bradley. After they got married, Susan and Jeffrey moved into a new home in the White Oak suburb of Houston, Texas. Susan would become a stay-at-home mom as Jeff was making enough money to support the family on his own. Then, in 2002, the couple would end up having another child, a girl this time, named Kaylee. Only a little while after they had gotten married, Susan claimed that Jeffrey slowly started to become abusive towards her. It started out as him being controlling and demanding. He demanded that the house be in perfect order, that she always have dinner on the table, that the laundry was done every day, and that the children were clean and quiet at all times. Now, Jeff, who had done a lot of drugs in his youth, had actually gotten clean shortly before he married Susan. However, not long into their marriage, he began abusing drugs again. And when he did, he would get very aggressive, not only with Susan, but also with their children. And Jeffrey had a history of being violent. He had previously been charged with assault after he had attacked an ex-girlfriend. He also had a couple drug possession charges on his record. As time went on, things only got worse for Susan. She would end up leaving Jeff one time, but returned home after only a little bit. Susan, however, never filed a complaint with police in regards to her husband's abusive behavior. Then, on January 14, 2003, Susan called up her friend to confide in her. Susan told her that she and Jeffrey had an awful fight after he had come home in a cocaine-fueled rage. She said he had then taken off and she had no idea where he had gone. The friend told Susan that since Jeff had attacked her, she needed to file a police report. She also told her that she should change the locks on her home in case Jeff tried to come back and he had another violent outburst. So on her friend's advice, the following day, Susan went down to the police station to file a report against her husband, and she also looked to get a restraining order out against him. Susan told police that the night Jeff had attacked her, he had come home after drinking and he was high on cocaine. He had quickly flown into a rage and assaulted his wife. After that, he had taken off and she didn't know where he was. She also said that he had threatened her life. Susan also told police that Jeffrey had returned back home that day after he had left. He had come back with a bottle of bleach and he had poured it all over the couple's bedroom. The police believed her as they had no reason not to. She also had various cuts and bruises on her arms and legs that were consistent with what she said had happened. Officers took pictures of the injuries on Susan's body, and then they issued a warrant for Jeff's arrest. While at the station, Susan also filled out a form to apply for the Victims' Compensation Fund. The night that they had had their big fight, Susan had actually called Jeff's mother, Kay Wright. She told her that her son had beat her in a violent tantrum and then taken off. Susan also told Jeff's mother that he was severely abusing cocaine, borrowing thousands of dollars to pay for a drug debt. They were behind on their bills, and he didn't go to his job very often. Law enforcement began asking Susan some questions, like where she thought Jeffrey could have possibly gone after he left the house that day. She said she had no idea. But Susan also wouldn't give police any information about where Jeff worked or any contact information for his friends or family. She also added in that things in their marriage had not been working recently. But only a few days after Susan had filed this police report on her husband, on January 18th, Susan called up her mother and asked her to come over to her house because there was something that she needed to tell her, and it was important. Once there, Susan's mother just came out with it and asked her daughter point blank if she had killed Jeff. Susan just put her head down. Then she told her mother that she had killed Jeff. She had killed him on Monday night with a knife. She had done it in the bedroom while the children were sleeping, and now Jeff was outside in a hole in their backyard. She told her mother it was only in self-defense because Jeff had been physically and verbally abusive towards her. Susan's mother immediately called her attorney over so they could tell him what had happened. After her confession, Susan's lawyer then called the district attorney and told them that there was a body in the backyard of the Wrights' home. It would be located inside a hole that Jeffrey had previously dug himself for a home project. Once she had gotten this off her chest, Susan checked herself into a mental health treatment facility. Once authorities had been alerted that Jeffrey's body was likely in the backyard of his own home, they went over to the scene, and there they would find him. Now, what was the reason that Susan had finally come clean, you ask? Well, a few days prior, she had gone outside to see that the family dog had actually partially dug up Jeff's body, and he had also taken off part of his hand. So, she didn't know what to do. Things had started to unravel, and she panicked. When police found Jeff's body, it was positioned in a sitting position, and his arms looked like they were trying to pull him up out of the hole. There were also ligatures and cloths found wrapped around his ankles and wrists. In addition to the discovery of Jeff's body, investigators also found a hunting knife underneath a flower pot. It had dried blood all over it, and the tip had been broken off. They also noticed that there was all kinds of things sitting in the backyard that should be inside the house. A bloody mattress, a box spring, and a bed frame. And inside the Wrights' home, investigators found that their bedroom was in complete disarray. It was clear that somebody had tried to clean the scene based on the painting supplies and bleach that they found there. There was also still some blood spatter located on the walls and the nightstand. Days after the gruesome discovery, the medical examiner concluded that Jeff had been stabbed nearly 200 times with 2 different knives. His murder was so brutal that the tip of the knife that was missing from the one found under the flower pot was actually found in his head. Jeff had also been stabbed multiple times after his heart had already stopped beating. Additionally, the medical examiner found that Jeff had cocaine, alcohol, and GHB, the date rape drug, in his system at the time of his death. Post-mortem nicks were also found on his eyeball and his penis. Red wax was found on his legs and scrotum. Susan was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. She would plead not guilty the following day during her arraignment and would be released on bond. What Susan had said happened on the night of January 13th was that her husband had come home after a boxing lesson, very high on cocaine. Jeff had started to play fight with their son Bradley in the other room, when suddenly Bradley came out crying to his mother, saying that Jeff had hit him after Bradley said he didn't want to play anymore. Susan said she then put the children to bed and afterwards sat down with Jeff to speak to him about getting help for his drug use as well as his anger. Additionally, she also gave him an ultimatum: either get help or she was taking the children and leaving him. After she made that statement, Jeff became completely enraged and shoved her to the floor. He then kicked her in the stomach repeatedly, dragged her to the bedroom, and raped her. Susan would later testify that after he had done this to her, he began standing over her with a knife, yelling, "Die, bitch." In fight or flight mode, Susan had been able to shove her husband to the side and grab the knife away from him. She said that during the struggle, it caused her knee to jerk, and she ended up kneeing him in the groin. She had then grabbed the knife, pushed him off of her, and started stabbing him in the neck. When he tried to get the knife back out of her hands, she began stabbing him in the chest. Susan said she could not stop stabbing her husband, out of fear that if she did, he would kill her. During this frenzied attack, the couple's son Bradley would suddenly knock on their bedroom door, causing Susan to temporarily stop stabbing her husband. She was covered in Jeff's blood, though, so she took his bathrobe, put it on, tied Jeff's arm to the bed, hid the knife, then opened the door. After Susan reassured her son and put him back to bed, she then went back into her bedroom and continued to stab Jeff. She stabbed him in the head, neck, chest, stomach, and legs. But again, she said it was out of fear that he would attack her, even though he was likely already dead at that point. After some time, Susan decided to drag Jeff's body out of the bedroom. But on the way, his head and shoulder had knocked into the nightstand, causing the red wax to spill on him. From there, she had moved Jeff's body out to the backyard using a work dolly so that he wouldn't fall over. She claimed that she was still scared that her husband was going to suddenly start attacking her, even after she had already stabbed him 200 times, and he was very clearly dead. So, once Susan had put him inside the pre-dug hole, she said she sat up all night long on her sofa, waiting for him to come back inside and hurt her. But if the kids are there, why would you wait for that? Wouldn't you and the kids take off? I don't know. In the days following Jeff's murder, Susan had gone to the store to buy bleach and paint. She had then cleaned the couple's bedroom and repainted the walls. She had also cut and removed a portion of the carpeting in the bedroom. Since everything was covered in blood, she also had to take apart the entire bed to dispose of it. So she had to drag the blood-stained mattress, box spring, and bed frame outside on her own. A couple days after she had killed him, Susan bought a couple of bags of potting soil and placed them over Jeff's body. Investigators would also find another stack of potting soil bags inside the family's truck. Additionally, after killing her husband, Susan had removed the outgoing message with Jeff's voice from the answering machine. She then proceeded to clean out their joint bank account. But she claimed that she was not trying to cover up a crime. The reason the house was so nice and neat was because it always needed to be that way. But that was because Jeff needed it to be that way. So if he was already dead, then what was the point? When the couple's son Bradley was later interviewed by a social worker, he would tell that social worker that his father had hit him 4 times in 4 days in January, the month that Jeff had been killed. But he also said that he had never seen his parents fight. A little over a year after Jeff's murder, Susan would go to trial in February of 2004, and she was still sticking to her story of self-defense. Her attorney claimed that Susan had suffered years of emotional and physical abuse from her husband, and she had only killed him in order to protect herself and her 2 young children. But the district attorney, Kelly Siegler, depicted Susan Wright as a scheming wife who seduced her husband into bed, tied him up, repeatedly stabbed him, and then buried his body in the backyard in hopes of collecting his $200,000 life insurance policy. During the trial, Susan spoke about how her husband Jeff had had multiple affairs during their marriage. He had also been using drugs for most of their marriage, even though his family and friends had thought that he had quit years back. The defense called a number of witnesses to testify, and many of them said that they had previously seen Susan with black eyes as well as bruising on her forehead. Susan's sister also testified that she had seen bruising on her body a number of times. She also told the court that she would give Susan $75 each week so that she could cover the cost of food and other things required for the household to be kept in immaculate condition, the way Jeff wanted it. However, he never wanted to give his wife enough money in order for her to be able to meet his expectations, and when she didn't, he would beat her. Other family members testified that Susan had been fearful that her husband would hurt her in the days prior to his murder. Additionally, the court heard testimony from a psychiatrist who said that Susan was depressed, disassociated from reality, easily frightened, and paranoid that Jeff would return to harm her. He believed that she suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, and he classified her as a battered woman. But the prosecution believed that 27-year-old Susan Wright had lured her husband Jeff into their bedroom on the promise of kinky sex. She had then tied him to the bedpost using his bathrobe sash and neckties. Once he was tied up, she had then used a knife to slash at his genitals. And then, in a murderous frenzy, she had stabbed him all over. The district attorney, Kelly Siegler, claimed that the scratches that were seen on Susan's hands in the photos that had been taken at the police station days after Jeff's murder were likely caused from the knife that she had been holding while stabbing her husband. And the bruises in the photos, she said, were likely from Susan pulling apart the large four-post bed all on her own and then dragging that along with the mattress, box spring, and her husband's body outside. To demonstrate just how violent they believed Jeff's murder was, the prosecution brought in the actual bed that he had been killed in. They did a demonstration showing how they believed that Susan had straddled her husband and stabbed him repeatedly while he was tied to the bed and could not move. And in relation to the injuries that were found on Jeff's legs, the prosecution showed the jury how that was more consistent with Susan being on the side of Jeff rather than straddling him, which indicated that the attack had not been in self-defense and it was actually planned.
It truly is the kind of story you could not invent.
It's overly theatrical, and I think it's overly prejudicial to the jury. I mean,
it's over.
And that is when the prosecution began.
But at this time we were offering evidence that exhibits 56 and 57.
The state says this is Jeffrey Wright's deathbed with blood-stained mattress and the ties that bound him. An assistant DA played the role of the 34-year-old victim.
And if I'm sitting on top of you and I'm holding a knife, move your hands up like you're trying to get me. That's all you can move?
While prosecutor Kelly Siegler portrayed the wife, an alleged murderer. Jeffrey Wright was stabbed 193 times, tortured, say prosecutors, in the most brutal ways.
Did you see anything consistent with a stab to the penis?
Not to the penis itself, no.
Because you saw what?
It was nicked. It was a superficial cut. It was more of a slicing.
Then there was the candle wax.
Started up in this area, went down between scrotum and the upper thigh.
And the mystery of the missing knife tip.
What did you find, sir?
Tip of the knife,
Where?
top of the skull. A downward motion like this.
The 27-year-old mother of two claims she had been abused and her husband attacked first. The former stripper also applied for money from a victim's compensation fund 2 days after the killing.
The prosecution argued that Susan had been fully aware of what she was doing. You can't stab someone nearly 200 times and not be aware of what you're doing. That takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. There's no way. They also said that as part of Susan's plan, days before she had killed him, she had reported physical abuse to her doctor, and then, days after killing him, she had filed criminal charges, resulting in a warrant being issued for Jeff's arrest. It was only after the family dog had dug up Jeff's body, the state concluded, that Susan began to panic because her plan was falling through. She had claimed that cuts to her hands had been caused by Jeff's keys, but then to other people she would say that Jeff's fingernails had actually caused the marks. Susan had also told some people that she was terrified her husband would come back and hurt her, despite knowing that he was buried in their backyard. I mean, she tried to cover up the crime, so clearly she knows that he's dead. During closing arguments, District Attorney Kelly Siegler said that Susan Wright was a card-carrying, obvious, no doubt about it, caught red-handed, confirmed, documented liar, whose frequent shows of emotion during the trial were deliberate efforts to influence the jury. In the end, the jury convicted Susan Wright of murder. She showed little reaction to the guilty verdict and was sentenced the following day to 25 years in prison. But then, 4 years later, in 2008, Susan again entered a courtroom to appeal her case. This time, however, she had another witness on her side, Jeff's ex-fiancé. His ex-fiancée, Misty McMichael, testified that Jeff had been abusive in their relationship as well. She said once he had thrown her down a flight of stairs. Another time he was charged with assault after he had cut her with a broken glass at a bar, but she had dropped that case out of fear of retaliation. In 2009, a judge would rule that Susan Wright had not been properly defended by her legal team, and a new sentencing hearing was ordered, which ended up knocking 5 years off of her jail sentence. On December 30th, 2020, Susan Wright was released on parole from the Lane Murray unit in Gatesville, Texas. She completed more than 16 years of her 20-year sentence. She will now remain on parole until 2024, will have to wear a GPS ankle monitor, must attend anger management classes, and is barred from leaving the state of Texas. While I definitely believe that Susan was abused by Jeff prior to his murder, I also think that this seemed to be more of a revenge plot, though not a very well thought out one. And I understand that if Susan was so afraid of Jeff, she would want to stab him extra to make sure that he was dead and didn't come back and try to kill her. However, nearly 200 stab wounds is overkill no matter how you look at it. That took her a lot of time and effort. She could have stopped, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 stabs in, and I think she could have been sure that he was dead after that. It's a very odd case, and I really do wonder what happened that night.